Some of you may have seen this drawing before. So what do you see? How many of you, this is your first time seeing it? Okay. What do you see? Just take a minute to look at it. All right. How many people see a young woman? How many people see an old woman? All right. Now, how many of you saw the old woman? Okay. Here's the young woman. Here's her profile right here. Here's her chin. See it differently now? Those of you that saw the young woman, do you see the old woman? All right. The old woman, this is the nose. This is the mouth. See it? Your perception, your perspective changed, didn't it? Did the drawing change? Right? It's all in how we see it. I've seen this picture many times, and this week when I was reminded of it and brought it up, I could not find the old woman for like 5 minutes. Even though I had seen it before, I kept looking and looking. Because it really is all about how we see. In fact, the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu would say, how we see the world is how we experience the world. How we see the world is how we experience the world. For those of you visiting today or that haven't been here this fall, we've been looking at the Book of Joy by Archbishop Desmond Tutu and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. They talk about the pillars of the mind and the heart, and today, for just a few moments, we're going to talk about one of the pillars of the mind that they actually begin the book with. And that pillar of the mind is perspective. Because they both agree, though they're from different traditions, that we create most of our own suffering in our mind. So we should be able to create more joy in our mind. In fact, the Dalai Lama would say that the ultimate source of happiness is within us. We spend a lot of time grasping for external things to make us happy. But these great spiritual and moral leaders say that happiness is within. The ultimate source of joy is within us. Their main point really is that it is our ability to reframe any situation that we're in that will lead us to the path of joy. Changing perspective. Again, the drawing didn't change. Our perception of the drawing changed. Jingpa, who is the Dalai Lama's interpreter and close friend and a monk himself, says that perspective is nothing less than the skull key that opens all of the locks that imprison our happiness. Freedom is in the attitude that we take. My mother used to say, and it used to make me crazy. My mother used to say, 99% of life, Penny, is attitude. Most times that did not help my attitude at that moment. But now that I'm a little older and a little wiser, I realize she was absolutely right. And her spiritual insight has stayed with me all these years. Viktor Frankl, the Auschwitz survivor, says that our perspective toward life is our final and our ultimate freedom. And if we could hear it from anyone, we should be able to hear that from Viktor Frankl. In my house, we have sayings that help us with perspective. Something will go wrong. We'll take off the top to a yogurt container and it will splatter out. And that moment of frustration hits and somebody will say, it's kind of a first world problem. Or I don't like this meal. That's kind of a middle class problem. And in fact, this week I was just introduced to a new saying. You know that saying, is the cup half empty or half full? This person said, when I am asked if the cup is half empty or half full, I say, I'm just grateful to have a cup. What the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu are saying is actually so much deeper than just a mere shift of perspective or attitude. Changing our attitude because we have more blessings than other people can sometimes actually distance us from other people. But they encourage us to keep our own deep connection to one another and to our common humanity, because perspective leads to more service, and service leads to more joy. Shifting our perspective is changing our mind, and that is not as hard as it sounds. In fact, it is far easier to change our minds than to change our emotions. We change our mind all the time. That's what a shift in perspective is. That's why they're calling it a pillar of the mind. When you shift your perspective, you recognize that our limited perspective is not the whole truth. In fact, we are myopic by nature. So we have to be intentional to shift that. Are you with me so far? So, the Dalai Lama says you want to look at every angle from at least 6, every situation from at least 6 different angles. So we're going to try that for a moment. I'm going to give you 3 examples of something I want you to think about, and I want to see if you can shift your perspective and look at it from a different way. All right, let's start with something very prevalent in the news this week. Hashtag take a knee. Take a knee. The NFL players kneeling during the national anthem. Country's completely split about it. Whatever you think about it, change your perspective for a minute. Look at it from another way. Now try someone who is annoying you. Don't act like you don't have people that annoy you. Are you married? I mean, just in general, not about my marriage, just in general. Shift your perspective. Look at it from another way. Lastly, think about something that you're disappointed in yourself. I don't know about you, but I disappoint myself way more than I disappoint other people, I think. Can you shift that perspective? Look at yourself from a different angle? Perhaps with a little more grace? Take one of those situations and hear the Apostle Paul's words, written from prison to the fledgling congregation in Philippi, millennia ago. And so, my beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is commendable, whatever is pure, think on these things. And what will happen? The peace of God will be with you. The peace that transcends whatever situation is going on in your life. When we shift perspectives, if we're between a rock and a hard place, a perspective shift might give us a third option. When we shift perspectives, if we're in a troubling relationship or a strained relationship, a shift in perspective may help us remember why we entered that relationship in the first place, what we loved about that person, what drew us to him or her. When you shift perspectives, when you feel stuck, suddenly more options become open. When you feel cranky about aging, a shift in perspective. This week I was thinking, for 60 years, my heart has been beating without stop. Thanks be to God. What other thing in the world runs consistently for 60 years? A shift in perspective. When you feel overwhelmed, a shift in perspective might mean, you know what I do matters. Any small act done with love is a great act. Shifting perspective. It's at the heart of what brings us joy. But on this World Communion Sunday, I want to invite all of us to look at what I believe is the most important perspective shift. In our society, in the United States, one of the things that defines us and who we are culturally, socially, and morally is a kind of rigid and rugged individualism. And that individualism, I believe, does not lead us to joy. Self-centeredness is our default perspective. And as the good old Baptist preacher would say, now I've gone from preaching to meddling. Self-centeredness is our default perspective. And studies have been done, you can find these in the Book of Joy, that the constant use of personal pronouns leads to greater risk of heart attack. I don't know how this works medically, but I know how it works spiritually. When we're only thinking of ourselves, our heart begins to atrophy. But when we take a wider perspective in our connectedness and interconnectedness, our heart begins to widen. Compassion exercises our heart muscle. In fact, medical studies that have been done say that self-involvement was a better predictor of death than smoking, high cholesterol, or high blood pressure. In fact, a psychological study said if you are using I, the people who use I and me more often are more likely to be depressed. Want to be healthy? Start thinking about other people. Start talking about other people. The greatest shift that we need is from I, me, and mine to we, us, and ours. Right there could use an amen, just right there. After 10 years, I still got to prompt you. Okay, it's all right. It's all right. It's the greatest shift that needs to happen. One of the reasons that we're in the situation we're in our nation right now is this I, me, and mine. It absolutely is, on all of our parts. And so on this World Communion Sunday, I can run my fingers over the globe and ask, where does it hurt? I'm thinking Puerto Rico. I'm thinking South Sudan. Thinking Syria. The list goes on. Where does it hurt? Everywhere. When we shift perspective, it's not some Pollyanna, like everything's okay, it's all good. It's not that. We shift perspective, and we're willing to actually feel, where does it hurt? Everywhere. That suffering connects us. And in that connection, our souls are widened. And in that widening, it may seem counterintuitive, but there's joy. Because we get another perspective. Oh, over here in Houston, a young father. Home was destroyed in the flood, and he was trying to fix it. And he did a GoFundMe. He thought it was going to take $40,000. Within 6 days, $32,000 came in his GoFundMe so he could fix his home. When I have a larger perspective, everywhere I touch in the world, there are great people doing small and big things for others. There are people who put their life on the line for freedom, for equality. All over the place, teachers are teaching young girls that otherwise wouldn't be taught in some countries. It is said that when you look at the world, you can have an overview effect. And that's when the astronauts flew, and the first time that we had been able to see as a people what our world looked like from their view. This blue ball floating in a vast expanse. And what they said was, there were no human borders, that we were one. And it forever changed their national and personal interests. So we may not be able to see that for ourselves, but let's have, as Tutu would call it, a God's eye perspective of we, of us, of ours, and know joy in the midst. Amen.